Hello there. So then we're continuing on with the Archetype series, this time looking at a very popular, though quite intricate subject in the archetype of the warrior. This is going to be a bit longer than some of the previous ones because this is a really important archetype for both the boys and the girls, so it's going to need a bit more elaboration. This one is going to be very familiar to anybody who has seen its popular expression show up in action films and fantasy books and video games and the like. Though if we understand these correctly, these are all external symbols that characterize the underlying archetypal expression that we're going to be looking at today. So it's wrong to simply look at the warrior such as Conan the Barbarian and think that's all that the warrior is. We have to look at the qualities that the expression is pointing to get a true semblance of what is actually being represented here. And I will say that even though this expression is commonly distributed through the male physique, because the archetypes are referring to universal patterns in the human psyche, this can be applied to females as much as males. And I'm going to be talking a lot more a bit later about the way that society affects men and women with regards to this warrior archetype. So don't let the outer forms that the archetypes come and fooling you into thinking that that's what an archetype actually is. It's not. It's the underlying patterns of behavior that are universally present within all human beings. That is the factor that we're interested in with these videos. So then, let's see what we can say about the archetype of the warrior. First of all, let's begin with the most obvious thing that stands out to us about the warrior, the warlike aspect of it. If we look into the most common renditions of our history, we see an image replete with wars and warriors. Images of war, conflict within and without, borders shifting, tyrants toppled by heroic warriors, warriors succeeding only to become the tyrants themselves. This is a common presentation that many of us are familiar with, right? And it's this warlike and aggressive aspect that has given the warrior its defining edge. And whilst this is not especially wrong in any manner of speaking, it is somewhat simplistic to only define its expression purely through the lens of aggression. There is a lot more to the warrior than that, and its surface expression of aggression and kind of warlike characteristic often contains the seeds of what truly defines the archetype, which to my mind is agency and overcoming. Like I said, aggressiveness, like the outer image of the warrior, is merely the externalized expression of the underlying archetype. And when we think of aggression, we typically think about it in relation to its conclusion, which is some kind of destruction or damage. But really, this archetypal aggression extends much further and deeper than that, because aggression is a stance towards life that we all feel, that energizes us to overcome a particular problem or find a solution to something. It's what motivates us out of our inertia and takes us to confront something that we need to do. That's the type of aggression that we're actually dealing with this archetype. So we can think about it in grandiose terms, where we might be intimidated or pressed upon by a bully or a gang, and that initial onslaught causes us to reel back and go into a defensive stance. But then another vector takes over in our mind, and we stand up to the challenge and we confront that situation. The warrior is definitely most active in that kind of situation. Or, to exemplify something a bit more mundane, you might be lazing around in bed for too long and go into that kind of sloth-like trance that we've all been in, and then a new vector springs into your consciousness and motivates you to get up and get on with what it was that you were supposed to be doing. That's the warrior current again. Just because that doesn't seem like a big deal or that difficult to us doesn't mean that the fundamental mechanism isn't being activated to stand up to something, to overcome inertia, and to claim agency over the world. It's still there in those kind of different situations. So the warrior is that part of us that activates the vitality of the system and energizes us towards confronting a certain goal, great or small, doesn't matter. The warrior activates, it stimulates, and it directs our attention singularly towards a particular problem. And we use that in many, many different ways throughout our lives. All right then, let's say something about the violent aspect of the warrior as well, because this, I think, is key to a lot of the confusion and the distortion that goes on around this archetype. Despite the fact that the warrior sometimes has to meet with violent ends, doesn't mean that its function is entirely destructive. In fact, its overcoming faculty and ability to face resistance actually sets the conditions for future prosperity. The warrior overcomes the conditions of his age and sets the foundations for the new conditions for the infrastructure, the trade, the culture, and the arts to flourish and spread forth from that space that's been created by the warrior initiative. We see this again and again in human history, where the warrior archetype has expressed itself and overcome human events to transform the course of history. Let's think of the Roman warrior emperor like Marcus Aurelius, who kept Mediterranean culture going for long enough for the Germanic barbarians to become contaminated by the effects of those ideas, conquer the empire, and successfully re-perpetuate them, thus rewriting European history for the next several thousand years. So the destructive aspect to the warrior is actually tied to its capacity for generative growth. And importantly, and this is another important thing, the relationship towards death. One of the most touching aspects of the great warrior traditions of human history is how their attitude towards death is so markedly different to that of the common man. From the honorary codes of the European knights to the samurai of Asia, we see this conscious relationship towards death in the disciplining force that steers the way through life. The warrior's clarity of vision and his poignant sense over even the most smallest of occurrences is wedded to the omnipotent knowledge that he will surely die. Life, as seen through the warrior's eyes, is never trivial. Every small instance is marked by the perfume of death's embrace, and by effect is given a special significance that the eyes of the cosmopolitan, in their luxury and in their security, can never truly access. That spiritual vision of the samurai, who meditates upon the pressing reality of his death daily, leads him not into the grips of melancholy, but into an outpouring of his life source that contaminates all of his actions. To those gripped by the warrior archetype, no breath, no thought, no action is ever meaningless, and action proceeds from him with a natural grace like no other, because he who is made a friend of death truly lives in the world. The violent component that accompanies the warrior's death pact is also dynamic. So when we say violence, for example, we really have to extend the parameters of that word a bit wider to encompass a wider definition of action. For example, a warrior can violently approach a bad argument in a board meeting, rip it to shreds, and convert it into a better one for the benefit of the company's initiatives. No one's been hurt in the process, except maybe a bit of pride on the part of the person who made the bad argument, but nonetheless, a condition's been presented, met with superior agency, and transformed for the betterment of the entire system at large. Here in the boardroom, the warrior is at play as much as he is on the battlefield, because the same fundamental process in the psyche that contributes to those events are still at play. Alright then, we also have to speak to this idea of mastery that's very essential to the warrior archetype. When we see the archetype fleshed out in movies and video games especially, there's this component of self-improvement through the mastery of a weapon or a fighting art that symbolizes the hero's graduation through life. Of course, the weapon itself isn't improving, it's just an object. It's the individual who is investing into that training and becoming more proficient at wielding that weapon that's actually making the real ascent. And this personal investment into a craft or a function that scales over time is something that we should all be familiar with, even if it's something like learning how to use a piece of computer software for work, or becoming better at cooking in the kitchen at home with all of those different appliances everywhere that each have their own functions and unique operating systems and ways of working. That compulsion to compel oneself into a system that can be carried towards the advancement of a particular goal is relying on the warrior component within us. The warrior harnesses the technology that has been created by the magician and uses that as their instrument for ascent. So here we can actually see the warrior and the magician archetype working together for the realization of a solution. Another really important component to the warrior is the commitment to a cause or an ideal that transcends the boundaries of the individual. The warrior possesses the internal discipline not to become obsessed so easily with the needs of the personal self, so that those needs become the world, as you see in people who are very self-orientated. Their preoccupations, their needs, their desires, that is the world to them. The warrior does not reject that world, though he seeks for a world beyond that. The warrior goes beyond that by choosing a path, a pattern, a system, or another individual as a vehicle through which it can transmit its power. Mythologically, we see this represented wonderfully in the image of Lancelot in Arthurian mythology, who many would see as owing his real loyalty to Arthur and Guinevere, yet in reality, his true allegiance was always to the idea of chivalry and the hidden god that lies behind the acts that follow from it. So this expression of transpersonal commitment is very central to the warrior. And even though we can look at its image and the actions that stem from it, there's always a deeper reservoir of life that's going on, very much in the spirits of the archetypes of themselves when you actually think about it. And I think this is what makes the warrior so universally endearing, especially to men, because it speaks to our capacity to seek agency in the world and to be effective at something, and the desire to hone our skills at something, and most importantly, what I was talking about dedicating our lives to something higher than ourselves. That's something that I think is very important to a great deal of many people, not just males, but I think in the case of masculine psychology, we seek to find that in systems and in things, whereas in the female case, they tend to tend to seek that level of transpersonal communion in another person, whether that be a lover or in the image of a child, for instance. And when they finally find that, it flourishes throughout the entire system, and we receive that confirmation that we're finally now really living in the world consciously, and not just as a passive receiver of what the world is bringing to us. And the warrior in all of us is the aspect of our psyche that goes out on its quest and seeks that. It needs that, and it gives us the power to get up and grasp our agency and overcome trial after trial for the successful transformation of the world. Alright, so this is something that I haven't done for the other archetypes we've mentioned thus far, because with the trickster and the magician, I've basically just gone over their core components and added a bit of context as to why they, how they reveal themselves in our lived experiences. But with the warrior, I actually want to start by adding another feature to the archetype, which is their fallen or shadow aspects. That's right, just as the composite structure of our psyche casts its shadow based off rejected or repressed material, so the archetypes possess their own inferior shadow aspects as well. And for every person this is different. So for example, somebody might strongly exhibit a full and positive side to the magician, but in a different range of their psychological expression exhibit a shadow warrior side. So they might be very perceptive, very intelligent, and be able to read into systems very well, and maybe even convert some of that into writing per se, for a blog or a book or a video production like this that's informative to people. So they're using that magician archetype very strongly in that for a good cause. But it's common for highly intellectual people to factor quite high in trait neuroticism, because they factor in more variables, and they might carry over a lot of unresolved angst from when they might have been picked on in school, for say, for doing well, and when they get older, they come home and they take that out physically on their wife. So, just in that one hypothetical situation, the capacity for aggression and agency and overcoming is dealt with through his shadow warrior, and the results are a net negative, both for the individual, of course, and for those at the receiving end of the shadow warrior's treatment. So that's a very, very rough outline, hypothetical sketch of the shadow warrior model. But I want to go a bit deeper now and look a bit more closely at this type, like we did for the full warrior expression just recently. Excuse me. So, shadow expressions usually manifest as a result of some area of a person's life that is in deficiency or has come about as a result of trauma. If we think of the psyche as this huge dynamic ecosystem of exchange, we see that all of these compartments of the psyche that we might classify under an archetypal category, like the magician, like the trickster, like the warrior, must and will express themselves in people's lives. We can't gag the mind and stop it from exhibiting the dynamics of its nature. And archetypes provide a very useful visual and metaphorical way of getting a handle on our respective psychologies, because it allows us to see how our minds are expressing themselves in a very intuitive and visual way that's very accessible to the way that we some people read into things. And in that respect, It's a lot closer to the way that a primitive shaman or occult specialists read into and visualize the dynamics of their inner lives. So, as we've already said, the warrior encompasses that part of our ability to seek agency, assault problems, and overcome systems, convert them even. And that energizing aggression that stimulates us to do that is present, of course, because it's the fundamental mechanism that informs the warrior archetype. But in a damage psychology, this aggression will filter through the created shadow and find its way into the world in the shape of a cruelty. We see this a lot in people who've been abused or bullied at school. They incorporate that pain into their own shadow and repeat the cycle of abuse and bullying onto somebody else that they encounter in their own lives. And there are two categories of cruelty with respect to the shadow warrior. This is cruelty with passion and cruelty without passion. Cruelty without passion is fairly obvious. It's in the name. This is cold, unsympathetic, merciless acts of aggression. Think of an assassin's ability to pull a gun to somebody's head and pull the trigger without any sympathetic regard to the individual who's been liquidated. Words like liquidated that I just used there as well, I think that was originally used in a Soviet term to talk about people who had been killed off by the regime, and they would say, this person has been liquidated. It's a very cold, a very unsympathetic and totally pragmatic way of talking about an act of violence, an act of cruelty that's been inflicted onto somebody else. Cruelty with passion, however, is like the warrior archetype on steroids, a purifying, untrammeled outburst of violence, as we see in the symbolic depictions of Shiva in Hindu mythology, the Hindu religion, dancing upon a bed of corpses, for example. This mechanism in the human world, however, is triggered usually when we are extremely afraid or extremely angry at something, and we could almost see it as a dramatic releasing of accumulated, repressed material within the psyche that discharges abruptly, like an orgasm of repressed material coming out in a fit of uncontrolled anger. We see this in a lot of people who've been very badly abused and beaten as infants, and the psyche is at that developmental stage when it can't process or react efficiently to the assault like an adult might be able to do. They can't defend themselves, right? And so the psyche dissociates and deposits that into a volcanic chamber of repressed material that builds up and builds up and builds up and accumulates over the years and discharges in violent outbursts as the individual gets older. And it finds its agency through the warrior, the shadow warrior, to discharge that, often in very aggressive and damaging ways, obviously. Along with this repressive anger and antagonistic stance against the world as a predator comes a bitter disdain towards anything that is regarded as weak or sensitive, which is, in all actuality, an unconscious projection of the shadow warrior's own inner weakness. And this is an all too common thing in human behavior, in how the world becomes a reflection of our own shadow life. So when we project extreme contempt and aggression towards certain features of the human world, this can often be a reflective sign of something unresolved within our own psychological patterns. Whenever I find myself, I've trained myself to do this over the years to try and kind of work with my own shadow. Whenever I find myself getting particularly cynical or particularly, angsty or moody about a particular thing, and I start kind of dwelling on that and running through narratives about things, being overly critical like we all can do, I've trained myself to turn that around. So if I find myself, for example, being extremely critical of somebody else for something that they're doing for right or wrong reasons, I turn that as a question back in on myself, and I say, well, how do I do that? And by doing that, you kind of convert that shadow projection, and you actually turn that into an inquiry that you can actually use to work on your own shadow. So that's quite a useful thing. Very, very simple technique, but very, very effective at actually starting to work with your own shadow nature when you find yourself in these kind of fits of cynicism or morbid criticism against the world. All right then, so with that being said, what happens with individuals who are self-destructive? How do they factor into this? Because when we look at them, the direction of that destructive trajectory that comes out through the shadow warrior is directed inwards instead of outwards. And this is where we see an aspect of the shadow warrior that we call the masochist. And the masochist is tied to the relationship between the shadow warrior and the heroic response towards the feminine world. And the reversal is also true for women. It's a projection of their shadow warrior and their heroic response towards the masculine. Individuals who carry a lot of this unresolved angst and aggressive emotionalism into their adult development often experience this feeling of impotence as their heroic masculine desperately tries to find its agency in the world. And this can also be expressed negatively towards the overwhelming power of the feminine that reminds the shadow warrior of his own impotence, and a frustration develops between his desire for ascent and the perceived obstacles that he fails again and again and again to overcome. We saw this reflected very well in the case of Elliot Rodger. He was a very good example of the warrior on that, the shadow warrior, at least on a mature level. He was trying to cast out and to fulfill himself like the warrior does. That's what it naturally does in the world. But due to the interference of the repressed shadow material, his attempts at ascent were met with continual failure, and that only further antagonized his feelings of impotence, which successfully converted into an aggressive rage towards the image of the feminine that his shadow held in contempt. Elliot Rodger was a very good example of the things that we've been talking about in regards to the shadow warrior in its weakling or masochistic aspect. So by now we should be able to see how informing these archetypal components are in the human psyche, and how important it is for a healthy maturation of their different components. The archetypes are the essential components of our human psychological expression, and the way that they reveal their patterns in the world are proportional to the relationship that we have to them and the cultural environment that we create through their agency. If we have a poor relationship to our psychological model, we will engender shadow expressions, and shadow expressions will then create a shadow culture, and the whole thing feeds back on itself like a destructive feedback loop, cannibalizing society and its members in the process. And now in closing, I want to talk some more about the ways that our Western society has contributed to this process, specifically relating to the warrior archetype. In the recent decades following the death of Carl Jung, who originally brought us the notion of archetypes, the warrior has come under a sustained attack from academics and social engineers who have pathologized the archetype as a dangerous brute in need of taming. Not only is their diagnosis of the archetype misleading and grossly incomplete, the styles of remedy that have been suggested have only contributed to the tensions in human behaviour that they were originally advertised to address. What had originally begun as an attempt to understand the issues of human shadow nature has resulted in an even darker destination, as masculinity has now unfairly been labelled as synonymous with violence, injustice, and oppression. The diagnosis has become a new disease. Ironically as well, it's those same iconoclasts of the masculine in Western society who, in their own aggressions, are under the grip of the very archetype that they are seeking to deconstruct. The shadow warrior sees its own reflection in the mirror and punches it. This perversion of the warrior has had a distorting effect on both men and women, as young boys have been indoctrinated into thinking that enthusiastic expressions of the archetype are toxic, whilst on the other hand, women have been encouraged to artificially recreate patterns of masculine behaviour as a triumphant act of vanity and ego worship. And they do this all the while their warrior lies suppressed behind a wall of deformative propaganda. The liberal world encourages us to live in ways that are not in accordance with our psychological maturation. It presents us with deformed images of our archetypes, images that demonize their mature expression and elevate the lower as expressions of virtue and a power and a self-assurance that we have never attained, because we have never matured psychologically to actually attain it. The world deceives us by playing to our weaknesses. On the one hand, telling us that we are strong and that we are brave warriors, all the while slipping us the poisons that make us feel weak. And the following morrow, as the effects of the drugs wear off, we will return to that place of clarity and become confronted with ourselves as weak, insecure, and fragile beings. And so we'll return to the seductions of the deceivers again and again and again, anesthetizing our pain with meaningless and empty platitudes that appeal to our vanity in the instant at the expense of our organic maturation. Most of these lies are obviously fed to us through the cultural organs that form and transmit new ideas to subsequent generations of human life. Culture is like an extended receptacle and retransmitter of the archetypal patterns. So like I said before, if we have people with dominant shadow sides at the helm of our cultural organs and educational institutions, expect to see that translated into the cultural patterns that come out from those institutions. Only a dysfunctional person would look at the masculine and call it toxic. They are the Elliot Rodgers of culture, perverting and populating the cultural ecosystem with the flowers of their own dysfunction. If we cannot see organic and honest representations of our mature archetypal psychology, then we will believe in the lesser variants and the distortions, and those figures will enter into our psychological system and affirm those active shadows within ourselves. There is always this direct conversation going on, always between the psyche, the culture, and the psyche, and one affects the other, like the character of a conversation affects the person who you are talking to. And let's say something about the warrior and women. Women are at an all-time record low in terms of self-esteem and self-confidence. And on some level, women know that all of the feminist power trips in the world cannot save them from the nagging feeling that something is not well within their psychological system. And the rates at which women are seeking medicinal aids, such as antidepressants, accounts for this. Females who embrace the manufactured shadow spells of the culture will themselves become corrupted at a young age, setting a template that will lead to a gradual prostitution of their power as both the inspiration and the gatekeepers of life. The archetype of the age for modern women is the prostitute, misadvertised as warrior agency, which the pimps of society milk for their own cynical ends. Feminism is essentially a shadow cult where for dysfunctional females and a drug dispenser for masochists who are the minions for the shadows of others. These demagogues have no interest whatsoever in the healthy maturation of men or women whatsoever, and it is in their utmost interest to constantly keep us from it. They do this through repressing the exercisation of her warrior and feeding women a false mythology of the world that confuses the ability of her magician to peer into the systems of the world and interpret them effectively. Repression of the archetype's organic expression is the surest way of encouraging its shadow variant, which is why many of these social programs that advertise that they are working under some humanistic intent actually create the conditions for the very things that they claimed to be fighting against in the first place. By demonizing the warrior and suppressing it within males, you are creating the conditions for a confused and corrupted boy who will grow into an anxious and frustrated adolescent who will turn, if nothing's done to develop his psyche into maturation, into a fallen masculine version of his organic potential. A dark destroyer, a weakling prince of his own fallen kingdom, another one of the free world's great lost potentials. And the same goes for the girls as well. It is in our society's interest to keep people psychologically underdeveloped, because even if these people don't know anything about Jungian psychology at all, on a very intuitive and a pragmatic level, they understand that by changing the culture and by controlling the information that gets into a person, you can affect what the person is inside, and you affect the way that they develop into adulthood. So that's why it's really, really important for us to self-educate and to truly know ourselves, warts and all, so that we can become the navigators of our psychological lives again. Forget about the institutions. Forget about Hollywood. These are now palaces of blackened rot that will fall by the effects of their own shadows that they have been casting onto us for years. For us individually, it's our task to continue the renunciation of their darkness and begin the true warrior's journey of self-knowledge and a healing of that shadow material that we hold inside of our systems, not only for the benefit of our own worlds, but in the return from ruin. And as Carl Jung himself said, shadow work is the path of the heart warrior. So then, that's been my video on the warrior archetype. I know it's been a bit longer than some of the other ones, but I really wanted to include that shadow side at the end of it, because I think that was really, really important to understanding the warrior archetype, because it is one of the major archetypes that is come under so much assault in the Western world today, and it's a very, very important one to know. Also, I think that not too soon, but I am actually going to have to get round to talking about the shadow in a bit of a greater detail. I think as it applies to both male and female psychology, and maybe this video is a bit of a primer onto something that could come out from that a bit later on. So I think that that's definitely something that I'm going to look into going on into the future. But for now, I think that we're going to leave it at that. This has been a pretty incredible video to make. This is a wonderful, wonderful archetype to look into. Very essential and important one. They all are really, but this is very, very important, I think, for both men and women, because it speaks to our agency. And without agency, we can't do anything in life. So the warrior is a very, very important archetype to reconcile your minds to, and to activate as much as you can in your own life. But for now, I think that we're going to call that a day. Thanks very much for watching again, and as usual, I'll see you again.